In the brittle October of 2003, a 26-year-old woman named Elise Tremblay stood at the edge of a bog that smelled like rust and rotting bark, and she thought, yes, this is it. Nobody else thought that, not even close. The land sat 12 kilometers east of Rivière-du-Loup, Quebec, tucked behind a tree line of black spruce that looked like they'd been standing there since Confederation and hadn't decided yet whether to fall. 40 acres of peat bog, saturated in black, the kind of ground that swallowed fence posts whole and gave them back crooked. The man selling it, a retired timber contractor named Mr. Fortin, had been trying to move the property for 4 years. He was a large man with a gray beard and the permanently squinting expression of someone who had spent decades staring into sawdust. He had tried to sell it to a hunting syndicate. They passed. He tried to list it as recreational land. Nobody called. Now, here was this young woman in rubber boots, her dark hair pulled back under a green toque, kneeling down and pressing both palms flat into the sphagnum moss like she was listening for a heartbeat. "You understand what you're looking at," Mr. Fortin said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the verbal equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Elise stood and wiped her hands on her jeans. She looked out across the expanse of tawny sedge grass and standing water and the low rolling humps of moss that gave the whole place the texture of a sleeping animal. "Yes," she said, "I do." He took her cashier's check with the brisk efficiency of a man who had stopped asking questions. He shook her hand once, firm, and walked back to his truck. She heard him on his phone before he'd even turned the engine over. She could not hear the words. She didn't need to. She had grown up in a small town. She knew the tone. Let me tell you something about the way small communities process unconventional ideas. They don't argue with them, not at first. They simply absorb them, turn them over quietly, and then release them as anecdotes, as cautionary tales, as proof of something the community already believed. In Elise Tremblay's case, the story spread from the municipal office, where the deed transfer was registered, to the Tim Hortons on Boulevard Cartier, to the volunteer fire hall on a Tuesday card night, and from there outward like a slow, cold ripple. The girl who came back from university with a degree in environmental science and spent her savings on Fortin's swamp. That girl. Apparently she's going to farm it. Someone asked what you farm in a bog. Nobody had a confident answer. A man named Mr. Arsenault, who ran the local agricultural supply co-op and whose opinion was treated in the region with something close to institutional authority, shook his head when he heard. "Peat extraction, maybe," he allowed. "But she's not set up for that. There's nothing in a bog that makes money unless you're a mining company or a mosquito." He said it without cruelty. He said it the way a doctor delivers a difficult prognosis. Gently, but without doubt. Elise had grown up watching her father farm conventional potato fields on the South Shore. He was a careful, practical man, and she had loved him, but his fields had always looked to her like an argument. A constant, exhausting argument between the farmer and the soil. He sprayed, and the weeds came back. He tilled, and the crust returned. He fertilized, and the yields climbed for 2 years before dropping again, as if the land were simply tolerating him. When he died, just after her 20th birthday, there was very little left. The farm was sold to pay the debts he hadn't told anyone about. Her mother moved to Rimouski to be near her sister. Elise went to Laval on a bursary and studied the science of ecosystems because she wanted to understand, in the most rigorous terms possible, what her father had been fighting against his entire life. Her professor, a small, precise woman named Dr. Beauchamp, who wore the same burgundy cardigan to every lecture, had told them something in the second week of first year that lodged itself in Elise's mind like a splinter. "Most agricultural failure," Dr. Beauchamp said, turning from the whiteboard, without looking at her notes, is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of observation. Farmers fight conditions. Ecologists read them. The difference in outcome over time is significant. Elise had written it down. She had written it down and underlined it twice. It was that sentence, more than anything, that brought her to the bog. Now let me explain what she had seen when she pressed her hands into that sphagnum moss. What everyone else saw when they looked at Fortin's 40 acres was impediment. Waterlogged soil that would never support a plow. Acidic ground that would burn the roots off any conventional crop. A liability, a money pit with cattails. What Elise saw was a cranberry farm. Not just cranberries in the abstract, not the romantic notion of them, but the specific, technical reality. Wild low-bush cranberries already grew in patches across the bog, small and dark red, proof that the conditions were not hostile but in fact ideal. The high acidity soil that killed conventional crops was exactly what cranberries required. The standing water was not a drainage problem but an asset, because commercial cranberry operations flood their fields at harvest, and her land was already half flooded by nature. The sphagnum moss itself, the thick living carpet of it, was a natural mulch that retained moisture and regulated temperature through the winter. Everything that made this land unsellable to anyone else made it nearly perfect for this. But it was more than cranberries. Her thesis work had focused on the concept of polyculture in wetland environments, and she had spent a summer at a research station in New Brunswick, studying something that almost no commercial farmers in Quebec were doing at the time. Combining cranberry cultivation with wild blueberry propagation on the bog margins and integrating native bee habitat deliberately into the planting plan. The pollinators would serve both crops. The bog margins, too acidic for cranberries, were ideal for low-bush blueberries. The blueberries would produce in late summer, the cranberries in fall. 2 harvests from one ecosystem. No synthetic fertilizer, because the bog's own organic cycle fed itself. No pesticide program, because the native bee habitat would build a balanced insect community over time. She was not going to fight the land. She was going to finish a conversation it had already started without her. The first obstacle had the face of Mr. Arsenault. She needed a small operating loan. Not much, enough for a water control structure at the bog's inlet, some drainage adjustment pipe, and a certified lot of cranberry uprights to supplement the wild stock. She sat across from him in his office above the co-op, which smelled of fertilizer and old paper, and she laid out her plan in the same careful, organized way she had presented her thesis. She had drawings. She had a projected cash flow with conservative yield estimates. She had cited 3 working operations in British Columbia and 1 in New Brunswick that ran on identical principles. Mr. Arsenault listened. He was a patient listener, she would give him that. He waited until she finished before he said anything. Then he leaned back in his chair, which was the kind of chair that had been there long enough to have a permanent impression of him in it, and he folded his hands. "Elise," he said, and the way he said her name, gently, like he was picking up something fragile he was about to set aside, told her everything before the words came. "Your father was a good man, and I know this hasn't been easy, losing the farm, losing him. But what you're describing here, it's a science project. It's not a business. Bog cranberries, native bees." He gestured at her drawings with a kind of fond dismissal. "This is what happens when you study ecology at university. You come back with beautiful ideas, but the market wants volume, it wants predictability, it wants fruit that looks the same size every time. You don't have irrigation infrastructure, you don't have refrigerated storage, and you don't have collateral." He paused. I can't put the co-op's money into this, I'm sorry." He was not wrong about the risks. That is the hard, honest thing to say about people like Mr. Arsenault. They are not villains. They are the accumulated wisdom of a community that has watched a great many ambitious plans fail, and they apply that wisdom like a brake. They are usually right. The problem is that the word usually contains a great deal of room. Elise walked out of the co-op into a raw November wind and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. Then she walked to the library, used the computer terminal for 2 hours, and by the end of the week had applied for a federal agri-environment grant through Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Ecological Goods and Services stream. It was a program that existed specifically to support farming practices that preserved wetland ecosystems. A bog cranberry operation, managed without synthetic inputs, qualified. She filled out the application herself 3 times until she was certain every word was right. Have you ever built something that required you to believe in it before anyone else did? Not just to hope for it or wish for it, but to actually behave as if it were already true, while the people around you offered their quiet, sincere certainty that it was not. That is a particular kind of loneliness. It sits in your chest like a stone, not a painful stone, a heavy one. That was Elise's first winter on the bog. She lived in a second-hand travel trailer she'd parked at the edge of the property. The propane heater worked most of the time. She wore 2 pairs of wool socks inside her rubber boots and ate a lot of canned lentil soup. She spent that winter doing what most people, watching from the road, would have described as nothing. She walked the bog in transects, flagging the wild cranberry patches. She mapped the drainage channels by eye and by boot, walking them in snowmelt and noting where the water moved fast and where it pooled. She identified the bee nesting sites along the south-facing margin. She was reading the land in the only way the land could be read, slowly, on foot, in all weather. In March, the grant came through, $42,000. It was not a fortune. It was a foothold. She hired one person, a 17-year-old, named Bastian from the next convention over, who needed summer work and had the particular quality she valued most in a co-worker at that stage of the enterprise, which was that he asked good questions and did not laugh at her. Together they installed the water control structure at the bog inlet, a simple wooden stop-log system that let her raise and lower the water level in the main basin. They cleared the bog margins of competing shrub growth to encourage the blueberry spread. They seeded the south bank with native wildflowers, red clover and wild bergamot and yarrow, not as ornament but as function, a bee pasture. The cranberry uprights went in by hand, Elise and Bastien wading through knee-deep water in late May, pressing the root bundles into the peat at careful intervals. Her back ached with a specific, deep complaint she had not known before that summer. Her hands cracked at the knuckles. At the end of each day, she sat in the trailer doorway and ate whatever was fastest and looked out at the bog as the light went flat and orange. And she felt, underneath the oxygen, something that was not quite happiness, but was shaped like it. The talk in the region had not quieted. If anything, it had grown more specific. People drove the concession road slowly when they passed. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Once, a man she recognized vaguely from the card nights at the fire hall slowed his truck long enough to roll down his window and ask if she needed help. The way he asked made it clear he did not mean physical help. She thanked him and said she was fine. He drove away, shaking his head with the gentle, mournful air of a man watching someone make an avoidable mistake. The first summer was thin. The cranberry uprights were establishing their root systems and produced almost nothing. The blueberry margin put out a small, scattered crop. Elise harvested it herself in a bucket, sold it at the farmer's market in Rivière-du-Loup, and made enough to buy diesel for the generator and a new pair of rubber boots. The man at the produce stand next to hers, who sold greenhouse tomatoes, looked at her modest display of blueberries, and said nothing, but his expression said quite a bit. The second summer was not much better for the cranberries, though the blueberry margin doubled its output and the bee population was visibly increasing. She counted 11 native species that summer, documented them photographically, and sent the data to Dr. Beauchamp, who was now consulting with a wetland restoration nonprofit. Dr. Beauchamp wrote back a brief, warm email. "You're doing it right," it said. "Slow is right. Let me stop here because I want to ask you something. How long would you have held on, not abstractly, but specifically, with the trailer and the cracked knuckles and the neighbors driving slowly past, and Mr. Arsenault's verdict still hanging in the air of the town like weather, with 2 seasons behind you that most people would have read as failure? At what point does persistence become stubbornness? And at what point does stubbornness become the only thing standing between you and the life you actually wanted?" I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure Elise did either. What I know is that she stayed. The third autumn changed something. The cranberry uprights, now fully established, flowered that spring with an abundance that surprised even Elise. By September, the main basin was heavy with fruit, dark red berries, small and intensely flavored, the way wild cultivated cranberries are, with a tartness that commercial varieties bred for size and uniform appearance had long since lost. She flooded the basin for harvest, the water rising slowly over the fruit-loaded vines until the cranberries floated free in a brilliant, bobbing red carpet. She had borrowed a small, flat-bottomed aluminum boat from Bastien's father to gather them. Standing in that boat, in the gray September morning, surrounded by that red, she permitted herself, for the first time, to think, "This is going to work." She harvested just under 4,000 pounds that fall. It was not a commercial-scale number, but she had spent the previous winter making phone calls, writing, emails, driving to food trade shows in Quebec City on her own gas money, and she had found 3 things: a specialty food distributor in Montreal, who sourced for high-end grocery chains and was looking for Quebec-grown, pesticide-free cranberries, a craft beverage company in Charlevoix that wanted a local, traceable source for its cranberry cider, and a small jam producer in Kamouraska who would take anything Elise couldn't place elsewhere. She had not waited for buyers to find her. She had gone and found them while the berries were still on the vine. The checks from that first real harvest, combined with the blueberry revenue, covered her operating costs with enough left over to repair the trailer roof and pay back a small personal loan from her mother that she had never told anyone about. It was not wealth, it was proof. Year after year, the operation grew, not explosively, not in the way that makes a good headline, but in the steady, compounding way of something that is correctly designed. She expanded the cranberry basin into a second, adjacent area of the bog. The blueberry margin widened naturally, the plants spreading laterally through the peat as blueberries do when they are happy. The bee population had grown to the point where a beekeeper from Temiscowata reached out asking if he could place hives on the bog margins in exchange for a share of honey. She said yes. Now she had a third revenue stream she had not planned for. Her costs remained low. She had no debt. She bought a small used tractor after year 4 with cash. She hired Bastien back each season, and eventually a second person, a woman named Joé, who had studied horticulture and was looking for work that felt like it mattered. She built a small pole barn for storage and processing. She stopped living in the trailer and began renting a proper house in town, which felt, the first night she slept there, like an almost unreasonable luxury. The cranberries began winning things. A food journalist from Le Devoir wrote a piece on Quebec specialty producers, and Elise's operation was mentioned in 2 paragraphs that, because of the internet, ended up being read by people quite far away. The Montreal distributor increased his order. The Charlevoix Cider Company put her name on the label. A cooking school in Quebec City invited her to speak, and she drove down and stood at the front of a room and explained, in the same careful, organized way she had explained to Mr. Arsenault 12 years earlier, how a bog worked. This time, people took notes. She had not become wealthy. She wants to be clear about that, and I think it is important that we are clear about it too. She lived comfortably. She had savings. She had no debt. She owned 40 acres of land that was worth considerably more than she had paid for it, and a further 15 acres she had bought in year 7, cash, from a neighbor who had shrugged and named a price. She was respected in her field, which in this case was also literally her field. It was in the autumn of her 14th year on the bog that Mr. Arsenault came to see her. He drove out on a Wednesday, his sedan navigating the gravel track to the pole barn with visible reluctance. She saw him from the basin, where she was overseeing the early stages of the fall flood, and she walked over to meet him. He was older now. Retired, she had heard. He had the look of a man who had spent his working life indoors and was not quite sure what to do with himself outside. He stood looking at the flooded basin for a long moment without speaking. The cranberries were red on the water. A pair of great blue herons stood at the far margin with the patient, ancient indifference of creatures who do not recognize property boundaries. The south bank was thick with yarrow gone to seed, pale and feathery. The air smelled of cold water and sweetgrass and the particular mineral clean of a peat bog in October. "I heard about the Le Devoir piece," Mr. Arsenault said finally. He was still looking at the water. "I heard about the cider label. I hear things, even retired." He paused. "I drove out because I wanted to see it." Elise's waited. He turned to look at her then, and there was something in his face that had not been there the last time she had sat across from him, 22 years old, and holding her drawings in a co-op office that smelled of fertilizer. It was not shame exactly. It was something more complicated than shame. It was the expression of a man revising a long-held certainty, which is a slower, quieter process than it sounds. "I was wrong to turn you down," he said. "I want to say that plainly. The way I said it to you, the way I talked about your idea science project." He shook his head. "That wasn't fair. I was looking at what I knew how to look at, and I couldn't see the rest." Elise looked out at the red water. She thought about the trailer, about the cracked knuckles, about the man on the concession road who had offered help she didn't want. With the mournful eyes of someone watching a drowning. "You were looking at it the only way you knew how," she said. "It was not absolution. It was simply true." "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know it would work when no one else could see it?" She was quiet for a moment. A heron lifted from the far margin on slow, enormous wings, crossing the length of the basin before disappearing into the spruce. "I didn't know it would work," she said. "I knew what the land was telling me, and I trusted that more than I trusted what I couldn't see." She paused. "My professor told me, the first week of university, that most agricultural failure is a failure of observation. I just tried to keep observing." He nodded slowly. He turned his hat over in his hands, which she noticed for the first time was the same unconscious gesture her father used to make when he was thinking. "If you ever want to expand," he said, "I still know people at the Regional Credit Union. I'd be happy to make a call." She smiled, and it was a genuine smile without edges. "Thank you, Mr. Arsenault, but I think I'm managing." He drove away down the gravel track, and she turned back to her flooded basin, to the red water and the cold sky and the herons and the low, sweet smell of the bog that she had spent 14 years learning to read. There is a particular satisfaction that does not come with noise. It does not arrive at a press conference or a grand opening or a moment of theatrical revenge. It comes quietly, the way water rises in a basin, until one day you notice that the whole field is full. Elise Tremblay had not set out to prove anyone wrong. She had set out to understand something and then do it. The proving wrong was simply what happened when those two things were done correctly. If you drive that road east of Rivière-du-Loup in September, you will see the bog. You might not know what you're seeing at first, the red carpet of floating cranberries, the pale flower margins along the banks, the wooden structures at the water inlet. It does not look like a conventional farm. It is not a conventional farm. It is a conversation between a woman and 40 acres of peat that has been going on now for 2 decades, and it has been, by any measure that actually matters, a very good conversation. Last fall, Elise's younger niece came to stay for a week during the cranberry harvest. She is 11, curious, serious, in the way that certain children are before the world sands it off them. She spent 3 days following Elise around the bog, asking questions about the bees and the water levels, and why the berries float. On the last morning before she went home, she sat on the pole barn step with one of Elise's old field notebooks open on her lap, tracing the hand-drawn drainage maps with one finger. "Did you know it was going to be like this?" she asked, without looking up. Elise thought about Mr. Fortin and his cashier's check, about Mr. Arsenault and his steepled fingers, about the trailer in November and the propane heater that worked most of the time. "No," she said. "I knew what I was looking for. The rest I had to wait for." The girl nodded slowly, still looking at the map as if this were a perfectly satisfying answer. And perhaps in the end it was.